Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 8th and final session for our Cannabis, Equity, and Racial Justice virtual series. I'm Mark Philpart of PolicyLink and the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. And this series is hosted by PolicyLink, the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, Youth Forward, and the California Urban Partnership. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the California Endowment, the California Community Foundation, the California Wellness Foundation, the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, Liberty Hill Foundation, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and the California Department of Healthcare Services. This session is recorded and will be placed on the YouTube channels of the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and Youth Forward. We'll also email everyone links to the recordings and the slides. Today's session is titled Advancing Healing-Centered and Trauma-Informed Approaches. And here on this slide, you can see the agenda. We'll begin with a few remarks from myself and get into some reflection questions to consider. And then you'll hear from our fabulous presenters, Dr. Christina Bethel, Child and Adolescent Health Measurement Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, and Kamar Paul Dhaliwal at the Richmond Rise Center. Finally, we'll close with Q&A and discussion, and we'll have a few closing remarks. As we get into today's session, I want to just share a few framing and reflection questions for you to consider as you are thinking about this work and how you begin to really operationalize this concept of healing within your organizations. Who and what heals you? How does your work heal? How does your work get in the way of healing? Really critical questions that we want you to ruminate on as you listen to today's presentation. As I mentioned earlier, today we'll be joined by Dr. Christina Bethel, Child and Adolescent Health Measurement Initiative of Johns Hopkins University, and Kamar Paul Dhaliwal with us, who is with the Richmond Rise Center. Kamar Paul is an Associate Director and co-founder of Rise, and together they will explore a roadmap for how organizations can build sustainable, culturally responsive, and healing-centered approaches to supporting youth. We'll also address how organizations can integrate the principles, practices, and recommendations from the roadmap into their organizational culture and practices. After their presentations, we'll come together to have a conversation and take the time to respond to insights in the comments section and answer any questions you all may have. So please, please, please share your brilliance, questions, and reactions in the comments section on YouTube. Again, in the comments section on YouTube. Now to get into the presentations and discussions, our first speaker is Dr. Christina Bethel. Born and raised in Southern and Northern California communities, Christina Bethel is a professor at Johns Hopkins University and is a lifelong advocate for the health of children, youth, and families. She's the founding director of the Child and Adolescent Health Measurement Initiative and leads the National Data Resource Center for Child and Adolescent Health and a range of projects to promote relationship-centered and data-driven partnerships to improve policy practice and equitable, positive health outcomes for children, families, and communities. I'm happy to pass this on to you, Dr. Bethel.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's really wonderful to be here. And I miss California. I hope you're all doing well out there. And I'm happy to present to you today a summary of a recommendations roadmap that we've had the opportunity to work with a number of California leaders on, and also to do a little framing on what we know about what's going on and why a set of recommendations like this are really important and how much promise we have because of what we already know about healing and some of the requirements that we can work together to manifest. So the recommendations roadmap, really at the bottom of it, are seeking to ensure a culturally responsive and racially just and really healing-centered approach, which is very different than many of the trauma-informed approaches that we have started out with. So that's the goal, and to use the recommendations to start to inform and really advocate for policy changes in how we prioritize funding, how we handle funding, how we handle evaluation of funding, and the measurements and all of the components that often go with funding communities so that they can lead the change. Oh, I'm not screen sharing the right thing. Okay. And I will you're not seeing my slides? You seeing my slides now? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're all good now, and I had been talking with you and sharing with you some of the work that has been going on in California that I have the honor to present today, and just reiterating that the recommendations roadmap we're going to talk about today was developed specifically to support culturally responsive and racially just ways to really promote a healing-centered model, which is very different than many other models, and to inform all of the expenditures that are available and increasingly available to communities so that they really work to promote those community changes in a healing-centered way. So I'm going to do a quick run through just to get us on the same page about what our call was, some of the possibilities that we know from some of the even very new research that we've been doing on the possibilities for flourishing in the diversity. And then I'm going to go over the roadmap with you briefly, and then Kamal Paul will be going into some more depth about how that is working in communities in California. So the very beginning, we started working in 2013 on a national agenda, which included about 500 organizations, many of which were in California, and developed a agenda that really focused on restoring and rewarding for safe, stable, nurturing relationships at every level, and changing how we fund and how we can enable communities to come together. And the whole work was really based on the understanding of what systems change requires. And before we can change policies and practices and resource flows, usually we have to change power dynamics. And we have to really change in that way relationships and connections, and who gets heard and who has voice and how that happens. And that really starts with mental models. So we've had enough data to kind of start to shift the mental models and shake things loose. So now we can start to work on the power dynamics and relationships and connections. And that's a lot of what was happening in the Prop 64 recommendations roadmap process. This is not something I expect you to read, but it's available to you. I work a lot on making data available to states and local areas so that they can own their data. It's always person-centered data that you can have access to and use in whatever way you want. And this is just a quick rundown on what we're seeing in California for ACEs. We have a syndemic of ACEs, meaning it's not, even if you aren't personally affected, we are all affected because it is intergenerational, it's accumulated. There's nobody who's not touched. So in this case, in California, for children with 2 or more ACEs, they're over almost 3 times more likely to have a chronic condition that's diagnosed. About the same for having an emotional problem, being overweight, obese, being bullied or picked on, a dramatic increase, having mothers who are not in excellent or good health, which is such an important part of, as you know, children's well-being, engagement in school, and resilience and flourishing, which we also measure, and really importantly, the hope that we carry in families that when things are hard, we have strength to build on, we have resources to lean on. So this is sort of what we are coming to this with. And, you know, we have complex risks. And I think the roadmap really is recognizing that it's not just about ACEs and treatment for trauma, but we have to address the social factors along with the relational factors, and in order to even properly help people who already have health problems. So this is just a little slide from some recent research we did to look at the relationship between relational health risks, which are really more in the ACEs domain, social health risks like food insecurity, economic hardship, racism, neighborhood violence. So we're looking at these as separate pieces because they interact differently. among people. And for just, if you have no social risk, the probability of a mental emotional behavioral diagnosis, let's say, is 15. Whereas if you have both relational and social health risk, which is a large proportion of the population, especially for the vulnerable communities or strong communities that have not been cared for properly or been supported properly, it's about 61%. So we know that the things we can change socially and relationally through policies and communities can make a huge difference for the health of the population immediately. And we have persistent inequities. This is just something you can look at later if you like, but we actually have data across Hispanic, Black, White, Asian American, Alaskan Native, American Indian. And what you're seeing is that the intergenerational context has indeed left populations that have been more exposed to trauma due to the factors in society that we can change have much higher complex risk, meaning they have both medical and social and relational health risks, which really add up, so that we can break the chain, because we know a lot about the healing journey. And this is actually from a study about we're all wounded and for different reasons, culture, history, our relationships, and we suffer. But we know that through an emergent process of recognition, truth-telling, reconciliation, building hope, and acquiring internal resources and having strong, unstoppable healing relationships, we can restore and we can build. But this is very much a different model of healing than we're used to in the medical model. So it requires a total transformation, which is really what the recommendations roadmap was acknowledging and trying to advance. And in particular, we know we can promote flourishing amid adversity. And the research is really clear that in the midst of adversity, we can foster a sense of meaning, engagement in life, positive relationships. And this flourishing is on a dual continuum with trauma and with difficulty, that most people who don't have trauma even, or diseases that really are not well, actually, if you measure it as by flourishing, but many people who have had a lot of adversity are meeting these criteria of a strong sense of meaning, relationships, engagement. And so really they're healthier than many others. And so we see stronger flourishing in communities that have been able to come together and work together on the things that are difficult. There's tremendous possibilities through any door to foster home, school, and community positive childhood experiences. We really know a lot about adverse childhood experiences. But the research we've been doing and some others are starting to do is just treating PCEs the same as ACEs. And in fact, ACEs Connection, I think, is going to be changing their name to PACEs to acknowledge the findings that if we can cultivate these positive experiences right alongside ACEs, we can start to turn the tide. And these are things like feeling able to talk to your family about feelings, feeling that someone stood by you when things were hard, had participated in community traditions, belonging in schools, feeling supported by friends, having some people in the community other than your family members who really take an interest in you, and feeling safe by at least protected by at least one adult. So the research is so strong that it shows that if you have a high level of ACEs, which is this 20.7, but high positive experiences, the probability in later life that you go on to have a mental health problem or depression is a third. So with high levels of positive experiences that we can cultivate in our communities among ourselves today, we have at least a lot of power, whereas 60% having depression or poor mental health if they don't have these positive experiences. So it's just really giving some agency to us as individuals through our relationships and with the supports we need as communities to be able to make this come true. And the cornerstone of all of it, before I go into giving you a summary of the roadmap, is healing relationships at every level, one-on-one, groups, and communities that have three major pillars. It's not the prettiest diagram, but I wanted to just say the three major processes for healing relationships are valuing, non-judgmental stance, authentic present connection, appreciating power. There's power issues and appreciating that, naming it, calling it out, creating authentic connections that are not transactional and that are equal. And also abiding, where we don't just drop in supports, but we make sure there's always connections where people have a continuous source of support, even if they change hands, that there's really a lot of accessibility for continuous supports that we can then trust. Because without trust, it's very difficult to heal. And the final is that by all of this data, I think gives us the information we need to choose to go beyond bouncing back, which requires that we not just resist what's happening that's hard, but lean all the way into it with the knowing that we can grow. And most communities who've been through a lot already know about this. It's a lot of other communities that, aren't really aware of the process of resilience and how we can become anti-fragile by allowing ourselves to grow and learn through the difficulties we face. And I think a lot of what's in the recommendations roadmap are based on these concepts, these values, and this vision. So I'm going to quickly go through this with you and then allow Kamal and us as a group to talk more about it. So the first goal for creating the recommendations roadmap was really to influence Prop 64 efforts. And we had worked previously on Prop 47 as well in a similar way to try to influence the expenditures so that they would be trauma-informed and healing-centered. And in our work here was to first create a working group committed to priority populations and ensure an inclusive policy development and advocacy approach. And so that was the first work, and we weren't sure how that would work, but it worked beautifully. And in organizations that were able to come together, many of you are probably on the call today or might be, are represented by these logos here. And it always makes me so happy to see the groups that came together and that it's growing as well as the ownership of these recommendations, of course, is put into the hands of all these groups. And these are the names of people. I will be sharing the slides so you can look at and honor the individuals that invested their time, but many others have as well. The second goal was to identify community-driven, culturally responsive, trauma-informed policies. And just figuring out what that meant and doing an iterative process was needed to make sure we kept coming back to whether that was true. And it was a very strong dynamic in the group to make sure that was true, and it probably can improve, but it was an explicit goal. And what came out was a recommendations roadmap. We have a website called prop64roadmap.org where you can access all the resources and also share those that you are coming up with that is working for you so we can maybe create a resource library. So we have the recommendations roadmap, executive summary, as well as infographics if you need them or want to use them. And this is what the infographic is, really outlining the 4 main pillars of recommendations, which I'm going to go through in a minute, and then the sub recommendations within them. So it's just sort of a visual that if you find value in it, you can use. There was the opportunity to come together as a group at the RISE Center, where Kamal leads work, and to vote on the different proposals, the different recommendations that were set forth in the recommendations roadmap to start to give some information and guidance to the implementation process, and also to send a stronger signal for where the feeling was the real need. So they're all important, but we did go through a process, and you can see Jim over there as well. And then finally work to create some toolkits, which should continue and be living on training and capacity building resources, learning-centered innovation, measurement, and evaluation, which is a very different way of evaluating than top-down metrics that often aren't responsive to what's happening in a community. So, and goal 3 finally was to impact in a direct way the expansion of State Prop 64 funding, to try to expand the funding and also direct it according to some of these recommendations. And we were able to do that in a number of ways, with a lot of leadership from Move Forward and many of the people on this call. And this is one example within the Youth Substance Abuse Disorder Prevention Program RFPs. The recommendations were featured as things that those seeking funding should reflect in their RFPs. So let me tell you just a little bit more about what's inside the recommendations roadmap. There are 6 criteria that we all agreed on through one-on-one interviews with all of the individuals representing those organizations you saw. And the first was to build on what has come before that makes sense. So aligning with the SAMHSA's concept of 6 principles for trauma-informed approach. Also building on that national prioritizing possibilities agenda, which did involve many of the organizations that were actually on the statewide committee as well. But to really deepen it to further culturally responsive, healing-centered, trauma-informed approaches. And that was really the call for this group to deepen. and give words to, and those words are important, and how we can take into account historical trauma and engaging the cultures and identities of those who are actually being served, but also leading the healing. So these were the different criteria, using a learning-centered approach to develop evidence-based, promising, community-driven practices, but in a way that allows for innovation and ongoing learning. So you'll see that reflected in the recommendations, which I'll briefly summarize right now. This is just another visual of them. So the first was looking at the importance of relationships and centering that as the first recommendation. So relationship and engagement-centered assessment, interventions, and healing. So how do we find out about what people might be wanting or needing, or how can they have opportunities to share that? And right now in the different settings of social work or home visiting or primary care, often that hasn't been happening. So prioritizing relationships, trust and safety, and community engagement as central to any effort. So you don't come in saying, we're going to survey you and do these things, but really letting it be driven by the relationship. To make sure that there's a recruitment and retaining of staff who really reflect and are known to the community that they serve, very important, often not happening. Implement trauma screening and assessment practices that are really anchored in relationships and trust, but also always look at strengths and resilience, and with the intent to promote well-being. Again, getting at the dual continuum where we know we can have maybe no trauma events, if you will, but not a lot of flourishing. And so keeping our eye on the prize of healing. And then to implement evidence-based, promising, or community-driven practices in all three of those. So there's some evidence-based practices, there's some promising practices, and then there's practices that are emergent from the community that also are important to implement and move forward. Even if they haven't made their way into some research program for evidence, they make sense to the community, and that there's a space where we allow that to be what goes on to be implemented. Often the approaches to healing are, I categorize them into time in practices, time with practices, time for practices, are some of the ways that we try to help people with healing in addition to all the community levels, and it's very different, and it's very much relationship based. So this is just a pit stop to say we don't get very far in promoting well-being and what we can do to heal without relationships. The next recommendation is looking at capacity building and really accessible, culturally appropriate capacity building. And the main recommendations there are to just, what's happening, I think already, is provide training and ongoing coaching. So it's not a one-on-one training, but it's an ongoing relational process of coaching, train the trainer, accessible consultation when it's needed and asked for, to be able to create the capacity that communities are able to develop with that kind of support. To require that funded entities also receive training. So if we're going to contract for services, that those entities also have training that is appropriate for them to obviously promote a healing-centered trauma-informed approach. To support and fund the development of retention of a workforce. There's a lot of turnover and burnout, and there's reasons for that we can address. So the importance of creating a workforce in the community that is sustainable, where relationships can really deepen and be counted on, and drawing from the community. And finally, to really allow the funding to go way down to the local community-based level, and especially tribal entities and communities harmed by the war on drugs, and communities harmed by the war on drugs. So there's details within each of these recommendations. So I'm giving the high level. And the final one here was to establish a state level clearinghouse, because often the resources, even that we're trying to put together to support the roadmap, are difficult to find. They change a lot, and yet we don't need every organization or entity or person trying to find everything out. So that is a really important piece. The last two is supporting cross-sector collaboration. And there's a lot of pieces to this, making money fungible, being able to share measurements of success. But the first recommendation here started with conducting an interdepartmental assessment across state agencies even, and other agencies that are maybe in some ways pushing down to the local level different requirements, different ways of doing things so that they can be more coordinated, and especially around the funding being used for substance abuse services, which are often very not trauma informed, let alone healing centered, although that's starting to change. And the second was to establish a plan. So we have a plan and a process to work that plan to increase the use of these approaches across sectors. So we don't just state it, but we actually work a plan, because transformation takes a lot of persistence and ongoing planning. And then finally, to require that funded entities collaborate with the community members, that you're not doing services in a community separate from that community, which is a big deal. And the last was to create a purposeful, enduring infrastructure to allow continuous innovation and learning and discovery and creativity to promote healing and flourishing amid adversity and to reduce adversity. And this requires a lot of changes to how we evaluate and measure. So the first would be to support local areas to be able to get data on their own their data and use it. And I wish we had a whole nother hour to talk about that, because there's a lot of work we've been doing to try to enable that. But that's very critical, because just finding out your own data can be a full-time job, require lots of pieces of information, but we need to make that really supported and easier. To fund communication platforms so that we can start to share the innovation and what's happening and create a learning system that makes the data available to stakeholders, both between the state and local, so we can start to continuously modify what's happening according to the feedback loop. To fund the development of an inquiry-based evaluation model that is looking at, we're trying this, did it work, what can we do to modify it? It's very unlike other funding where you get a program, you implement it, and if you don't, you get in trouble, or you have to use measures that are handed to you. So this is very much a inquiry-based evaluation model and implementation model. And the last two high level here were to support funded entities to learn and improve on implementation using that evaluation model, which is a little bit more hands-on support, where there's an enabling of the folks in the community to build the capacity around how to do that. And finally, to establish and fund learning cohorts so that we can start to learn from different parts of the state or the different communities within the same region to be able to be supported to keep coming together. And that's really where I want to leave this part of our talk and turn it over to Kamala Paul, is that in terms of a collaborative approach, we need collective awareness, collective engagement, collective agency, collaborative safe spaces, and collaborative action. And the roadmap really outlines recommendations related to each of these. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Kamala Paul.
Thank you, Christina. Really appreciate that insightful presentation. As I mentioned earlier, Dalia Dalia is the co-founder of RISE. She supports and guides the implementation and integration of healing-centered practices grounded in racial justice and liberation across RISE's program areas. She also develops, promotes, and advocates for policies, investments, and practices and research that enliven healing, justice, and liberation across the fields and sectors in which RISE works. Thank you for joining us, Kamala Paul. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Christy. Thank you to the whole team that's making this happen. And most of all, I just want to thank the young people who are visionaries for this space that I get to be a part of in this community called the RISE Center. And hello to everybody out there on the streaming, the YouTube, wherever we are. Want to invite yourselves to take a few deep breaths. You know, if your shoulders are tight, let them loose for a bit. Just take an intentional moment to breathe and move and integrate. So RISE, as I said, RISE was born out of the vision and organizing of young Black and Brown people in Richmond and in West Contra Costa. And what I'll share is that the young people who organized for this space did so knowing that they would not directly benefit from the programs and services. So these were young people thinking about their younger siblings, their cousins, the next generation. So at 14, 15, 17, 18 years old, thinking about how can they set something so that their communities feel love, feel belonging, and feel justice. And I think that's really important to share as we think about healing-centered work and healing-centered engagement and what it takes and what it means. It's beautiful, it's profound, and it's hard, it's messy, and systems get very threatened by it. So I'll keep talking about that, but I just want to sort of share who rises and give you a little bit of flavor. We'll be showing some videos shortly as well. Go to the next slide. And Sarah Michael, I think, has volunteered to read out loud what some of our young people have shared, what healing means to them.
First quote reads, "Healing looks like education. If people understood their privilege and how their actions can deeply affect someone, I think that it would help a lot of people who are struggling with these issues." The middle quote, "Realizing institutions don't work for you, but against you is the first step to healing your community." And the last one, "We know we can't run the city. It's too complex, but our experience and our voices should count, especially because we're the most affected."
Thank you, Sarah Michael. And as Mark offered the reflection questions at the beginning, who and what heals you? How does your work heal? What gets in the way? You know, for us, when we talk about our work and we think about our work in a radical way, radical meaning at the roots, young people of color are roots. And so how they define and articulate and express and share what healing means to them, our job is to be attuned to that, to reflect that back and to build the kinds of culture that they want and need so they can feel healing. And so for us, naming the ecologies of violence that young people have to navigate every day is very critical to our healing work personally, interpersonally, as an organization, and as part of a broader ecosystem. Next slide. So I wanted to also share these words from our clinical director who recently passed away unexpectedly, suddenly last month. And I wanted to bring Marissa here because she and I actually were scheduled to be part of this together, along with some of our young people. And so I just think, you know, her words and her memory and her legacy are so critical to how we move this. And I just wanted to make sure that she was held and seen in the space today. And so I'm going to read this quote that she shares about her work. Young people's response to violent, oppressive systems are often pathologized. I believe my role in counseling is to validate their experience, relocate the problem outside of the young person and back onto the system, and name how systems have been and continue to be set up to harm marginalized communities. In sessions, young people get to reimagine what healing and liberation looks like for themselves and their communities. I love that I get to be a part of young people's healing journeys. Healing is hard work, and there's also a lot of laughter and celebration in the process. And so we've heard a little bit from our young people via Sarah Michael and myself, speaking from Marissa, but we also wanted to share some of the other ways in which young people have expressed what healing is for them. And so we have a series of 3 short videos that we're going to share. And so the first one we're going to queue up is actually one of our young folks who's now on our staff, Dalia Ramos Musino, and she's going to share her experience at RISE.
So I started coming to RISE when I was 14 years old. It was a really different space for me. I was used to people not really liking me around. I felt like I was really bad in school, like I didn't get along with no adults. I had a lot of problems at home, and then coming to RISE was a really different experience. Like, it was really positive. Like, people actually like you coming to RISE, and I was like, what, you like me? You don't even know me. Why do you want me here? So they really made me feel welcome. They made me feel loved. They actually gave me the opportunity to become an intern when I turned 16. And I went through the whole intern process. Back then, it was a 2-year limit of an internship. And once I completed the 2 years. They asked me to come on to staff, which for me was a really powerful moment where I felt really powerful and important. Like I had something to offer. They not only showed me different trainings, they taught me how to talk to people, how to express myself, because that's something that was really hard for me to do. They taught me how to connect with people, and it made me want to be a better person, not just for me, but like for my siblings, for young people coming into the center. Like having the opportunity to be there for somebody else the way somebody was there for me really brings me joy and makes me feel fulfilled in life. And I hope that I can be that staff that the other staff was to me when I was a member.
Thank you. So that's a little bit from Dalia, who I can share is actually out on family leave with her baby. So Dalia started at 16 and now is our, our community engagement program manager at RISE. And so our next video is actually of one of our members and fellows, Gio, who's going to be sharing a piece that he wrote around the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, and the war on drugs.
We followed your laws. We learned your codes, your connections, your deadlines, your masteries, and you learned our nothing. You locked us up. What is mass incarceration? It is the avoidable pain of you trying to kill us, trying to commit genocide over a nation that is the backbone, world terror and militia, tackling battles like war on drugs, but this time it's on black folks. The youth seem to be the target, digging graves for our future generations, so you plan to have us bow down to your lower companion. What is mass incarceration? It is the language you use to try and manipulate small-time offenders into world criminals, slaving us into your labor just so we can be worked off of. Instead of calling it slavery, you called it the prison system. And that makes Republicans Abraham Lincoln. That makes the cow gang system the 13th Amendment. That makes us, our ancestors, slaving. You told us we weren't fit to walk the earth, but black wrists slides their way into handcuffs so easily. Brown hands seem to cuff prison bars so smoothly. My ancestors' spirit surpasses gates and fences so tightly. What is mass incarceration? It is a sign of you telling us to get off this land, been shipping us in metal containers like we're dogs. You've been oppressing the oppressed more than what the oppressors can hold, can know. Tell us you run this country. Columbus, our holidays, our traditions, our bodies, our jobs, our futures. Like, what do you mean discover? How do you discover something that was never gone missing? Wrinkled hands and bloody fingers demised over hard labor, and you tell the world we are criminals. You envy the words that are brushed past your ears. You colonize prison cells and call us to live in them, picking cotton over stone. You sway the flag of America over stolen dirt, sabotaging a land that can never be brought back. So you decide to create foreign policies, letting inmates feel weaker than you, punishing us just for being colored, black bruises inking jail beds, screams of victims you've changed. You think the system is so intact, so why haven't you gotten yourself into it yet? You silenced our voices. You tried to re-educate us. You made us the villain somehow, but you kept our past stories recorded. And that there is what mass incarceration is.
Thank you for listening to Gio. And again, going back to what we heard from young people, that realizing the institutions and systems are here not to work for us, but against us is part of healing. Might not be all of it, but it's part of it. And that is our work to make sure that we name that and give space for young people to name it. And this last video is actually a video around what it means to organize and mobilize around campaign work to make sure that the resources and investments that rightfully belong to us come to us. So this next video is for a campaign that we led in the city of Richmond for a general fund for children and youth in our city.
I'm supporting Measure E and K in Richmond so current students can get the support of tutoring to pursue their college dreams.
I'm supporting Measures E and K so that my grandchildren can have a safe, healthy, loving future.
I'm supporting Measures E and K because it will raise money for me to get outdoors, learn new things, and become a leader in my community.
Join us in supporting Measures E and K in Richmond so our city has the funds it needs to support our youth and vital life-changing programs.
I am happy to share that both measures passed, passed with a lot of opposition from city leaders who do not see an investment in our children and youth as something to prioritize. But it really, again, was the mobilizing power, the beloved power of our communities and our young people that pushed us. And we are now actually, I think, in the first round of funding for the first cycle of funds from the City of Richmond's Department of Children and Youth. So thank you for watching, for listening to our RISE community through the quotes, through the videos. And for RISE, we were part of the roadmap, and I will share, and Christy knows this, that the process around even developing the roadmap, when I look at it and hear it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of work to do to be healing, right? Like that's a lot to do to have to prove that healing is actually something that is worthwhile and that we deserve it. And so I'm saying that as someone who was very much embedded in that process and as an organization, but I just keep being reminded of that, our work is to sort of hold 401 years of nation building, of trauma and distress, and also hold the possibility and the necessity of dreaming and visioning the world we deserve. And so that, again, it's not easy, but I look at it also as it is a gift for so many of us to be called to this and to be able to do it. And so as an organization, and hearing from young people, understanding that when we address trauma and distress, we have to address it within understanding the systems as the stressor, that the system is the risk. And our young people are coping in all the ways they can to be able to mitigate and reduce the harm of the risk, again, which are our systems. So I'm going to, this next slide, there's a lot on it, but again, we will share it. But I wanted to share how we've come to understand our framework as an organization, as a healing-centered organization. And this is the framework and the approach that we use in our work across all our programs, our infrastructure, around understanding that where trauma and distress lay and the layers of it, and also where our liberation and healing also lies. So we use this to sort of look at where are we around these levels, what's the connection, but our hope and our aim has been, and this is included with the partners we work with on the roadmap, is this something that we can actually build amongst the ecosystem? Can we see our systems and our funders actually using this frame, or a frame that really speaks to the multi-layered and the syndemic understanding of trauma and healing? And so I'm going to go into the next slide, or we're going to be put into the next slide. I'm going to share some of our organizational kind of praxis that I think speak to what Christy shared. And I'm even thinking about the order of the presentation, and that, I want to be clear that the science is always catching up with what we already know. And especially for Black and Brown and subjugated communities, we're figuring this out. We're way ahead of the science and the systems. But we also, if we've signed up to be part of organizations working with systems, then this is our work together. And so just want to also name that. But again, prioritizing relationships and connection. All of our programs are platforms to build loving, healing, and just relationships. So what that means is we might be running a tutoring program, or sister circle, or young men's group, or our anger management, which we call BFAM, breaking the frame of anger, because we actually believe anger is very useful and necessary for our healing and liberation. That for us, the outcomes and the productivity is, have we shown up in relationship? Our organizational outcome domain, the key domain is, do young people feel loved? So if we got 50 resumes out, and met our funder goals and outcomes, I mean, not a bad thing to have a resume. I probably could update mine. But if that's all we did, and young people didn't feel connected to staff, didn't see the possibilities of who and what they can be in that process and how they can be in relationship, then we have failed as an organization. We have actually misused the funds that rightfully belong to our communities. And so that's when we talk about prioritizing relationship, it also means prioritizing and reprioritizing investment, resources and time, and not being on the timeline of funders or systems of researchers, but on the time we move at the pace of trust, of loving trust with our young people and each other. I can't say this enough, that we have to have a race and justice analysis in all our work. Healing is not about individual interventions. Healing, there is co-regulation, there is connection with people and between people that is critical to healing. But again, healing-centered engagement and certainly repairing the harms of the war on drugs requires us to also be in engagement and to tell the truth, to say the things we're not supposed to say in our work. And as you've seen, even from what our young people have shared, saying the things we're not supposed to say, that the systems actually are working exactly how they're supposed to keep us subjugated, and yet we still rise. And that, I think, again, is what we are grappling with. But again, the gift of being able to move healing-centered programming and praxis. Healing-centered engagement means that we are clear in our values and that our values drive everything. And so that means that for healing-centered organizations and programs, being really clear about what we value, what we prioritize, and how do we match up and calibrate the way we're in relationship and what we're doing to our values. As conditions change, strategies might change, tactics will change. As we know in this last year that we've been in, we've had to make rapid pivots because of the pandemic and the ongoing pandemics of supremacy. But our values are what keep us anchored. And again, that's really critical as we think about our work, so we can remain adaptive, but also predictable. And then the last thing I'll say here, again, like this idea of love and rage, that we need to foster social and emotional health. I think the quote from Marissa was about how do we connect with young people, people feel like there's a relationship, but also share that what you're feeling is a reasonable response to systems that aren't set up to take care of you. So that political education and development and reflection is just as key. Go to the next slide. Some of our other practices is that we have to take care of the people who are taking care. And so as a healing-centered organization, we must invest in our community and our staff just as much as we invest in making sure we're meeting young people where they are. And I think that's a really different way of being, certainly the nonprofit industrial complex, sort of social services, delivery of care, that it really requires that we are tending to the needs, the vicarious trauma and distress, but also wanting staff to bring in, what are your hobbies? What are your dreams? What are skills you have that might not fit on the job description, but actually we want to see all of yourselves in this work. And so what can come to it? So, we've had knitting classes that have been just like, knitting and sharing stories about the week. And so how do we bring those pieces in? Because then young people also bring in their interests. We have a bunch of videos I could have shared around the amazing recipes young people come up with on very little resource. And so we've made TikToks to share with members about things that they can cook and create. So, making sure that that's there. I think what else I want to share here is that really when we look at decision making as an organization, it needs to be transparent, clear across the organization, and that it's based on the proximity to the responsibility of the work. And so I will tell you, I don't know half of the programs running on a daily basis, not because I don't care about them, but because we have staff who are doing what they need to do. My job is to make sure they have the support they need, right? And I'm showing up proximate to them in what they need in our system to do that. And sometimes that might mean connecting with members and their families directly, but my job as the associate director is to be in service to the staff that are holding our young people. And I think another thing really important, we are an organization, we have a structure of people who are supervisors, people who are supervised, but we're very clear that, there is not sort of a military command to who you get to talk to when, that conversations can happen where and when they need to, and we trust we'll move through them and figure that out. So everyone can and does go to our executive director. to share what they're excited about and also what they're concerned about. So we like it when there's good things happening, and people tell our executive director and myself as well. We have a lot of time off, and we've had some of our partners actually share like, wow, that's a lot of time. And we're like, yeah, we deserve more of it. I mean, we have to tend, but we're also really clear that having staff only use like, oh, these are my vacation days, so I'm going to use those to get some rest and decompress, that we as a system have to actually rest and pause. It's not enough for one department or some staff to take time off, which they can and they do, but we actually shut down for at least 1 week during the year that we call our restoration week. And it really is. When we shared this first with our members, because our main concern was we're not going to be there for our youngsters, what they said to us was, yeah, you really need it. We need you to go rest because we see y'all acting up. We can, your energy's funky, like go get some rest, get yourselves together and come back. And that really was, really remarkable for us. And it reminded us of the importance of the partnership and proximity and relationship. We run, a nonviolent restorative communication protocol. This is something that we do with members, with staff, with partners. So I think part of also being healing centered and engaged is that there's nothing that I would ask staff to do and that I wouldn't do. And so if there's harm and I have some part in it, I have to actually show up. And because I have more positional power, I have to also take more responsibility. But we actually have protocols in place that are transparent to everyone and even shared with during our member orientation. I'll go to the next slide so I can finish up. Something that I know I've been in conversations, and there's a lot of conversations about what does it mean to be at this place where there's a lot of will and growing will by our systems, and I think particularly our health systems, social services systems, to really shift these models of service delivery, transactional work, prioritizing productivity to being relationship-centered, healing-centered. We are at that awkward place of this is what we want, but we still got to imagine it. And we're still using the tools and the mechanisms of supremacy. So I'll share even in like the RFPs for the Prop 64 funds that have come out, the frame is certainly important. It reflects the roadmap, but there's still some incongruency in some of the questions and what we're expected to report on. And that's not a bad thing. It can be stressful, but we have to be able to name it. But I think something to really remember for those of us, wherever we are in our journey around being healing-centered organizations, programs, is that, the resources that we hold, they already belong to our folks. That while we have to go through some processes to procure them back, they never belong to the systems. And any funds that any of our systems hold are those of the people. And I share this sort of first and foremost because even through my own learning, really understanding that living in capitalism and white supremacy, that where the money is where we assume the knowledge is. And we really have to disrupt that because that is so not true. The other piece I want to share out loud here is that there's a lot of useful, needed sort of information, science, research around resiliency. We should not let that go. But what I want to share, especially for any of our systems partners, is that if resilience is the benchmark and the sort of the ceiling, that can be also a harmful sort of trope around health, wellness and healing, that for BIPOC communities, the fact that we're here is enough. We don't need to prove our resilience. And that resilience is really in the frame of structural violence, being able to put up with violence. And we've been doing that. Like, we don't have to actually sort of show that. We actually need to be resisting. We need to be dreaming. We need to be visioning. I think we need our white colleagues to maybe build resilience around disrupting the systems that protect you, and even some of our white adjacent colleagues, including myself, who've been protected. So I will stop there. The last thing maybe I will stop with, though, is that healing is way more rigorous than any RFP, than any logic model, than any outcomes, and it is also way more joyous. We laugh a lot at Rise amidst all the pain and distress. We got jokes for days, months, years, centuries. And so I'll end there, and thank you for listening.
Paul, thank you so much for presenting with such, intellectual sharpness, power, and soul. I always enjoy hearing from you and hearing from your community. The young people had me just beaming, and if the camera was on me, would have saw me snapping and tearing up all at the same time. It was beautiful. I want to bring you and Dr. Bethel into a quick Q&A here. There were a few questions that were posed in the chat that I'd love to get your responses to. For you, Dr. Bethel, there was a question about the report, one of the reports that you shared and when it came out. And then there's a follow-up question about whether there's been any further data collection in light of, all of what's been happening regarding the pandemic and isolation and racial unrest, et cetera.
Okay, so there's two things I'm thinking it might be. The California Strong Roots Grow a Strong State kind of data that I showed is based on the most recent National Survey of Children's Health, which collects representative data in California. And we've also done a lot of spinning to look at local estimates as well. And yes, that data is yearly. And so as we get it, we update those fact sheets. But those were most recent as of 2019. The recommendations roadmap was also released in 2019. And so if that's what you were talking about, that was the date on that. And yeah, but I think you were talking about the data. So
yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul, so much to unpack in your comments. For organizations that are vying for Prop 64 grants, who are looking to, mirror some of the approaches and perspective that you articulated, is there an opportunity for them to engage you and learn more about some of what you outlined today?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we are who we are because of each other. And so we need that connection. We need that kind of mutual learning and sharing. Rise exists because of the movements before us. So we want to be part of that legacy. So we hope and want to stay connected.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to ask all of you watching virtually to thank our presenters. And I'm going to go ahead and close and just thank all of you for tuning in to this critical discussion today. Throughout January and February, we've hosted 8 of these virtual convenings, basically 2 per week. None of this would have been possible without a whole host of folks, including our co-hosts Youth Forward and the California Urban Partnership, our sponsors, over 20 speakers and presenters, and the Spark Street digital team, who's been the mastermind behind our production and visuals. Shout out to everyone who's collaborated on this series and made it possible. Just to give you a quick overview of all the sessions, we started off with a series that was centered on how do we ground this reparations and truth and racial healing work in equity and justice when we think about the cannabis grants that were coming from the state. In session 2, we discussed the Prop 64 grant programs and the $80 million that will be distributed in the coming months. Session 3, we focused on the design of youth-serving organizations that have received Prop 64 funds and how those organizations are responding and innovating given the social distancing and the additional stress and pressures of youth created by the pandemic and racial injustice. Session 4, we focused on an overview of the status of equity in the cannabis sector and approaches needed to close the racial wealth gap, especially the criminalization of cannabis. In session 5, we were joined by organizers and researchers preparing to organize and work around redirecting local cannabis taxes away from law enforcement and toward community reinvestment. And then we finished off the series with session 6 and 7, discussing the ways local groups can ensure cannabis is regulated safely and how coalitions can build power and opportunities for communities and people most deeply impacted by the war on drugs. All of these sessions and their full descriptions can be found on the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and Youth Forward YouTube pages. Subscribe to the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color YouTube page and be on the lookout for follow-up videos on these topics. For those of you who have registered for these events on Eventbrite, the Youth Forward and ABMOC teams will be emailing you about opportunities to stay engaged in the near future. This work is just getting started. We'll need your continued support and the collective capacity of all of you watching and all of your networks to ensure that Prop 64 continues to be implemented across California with racial justice, equity, and healing at the foundation. Thank you again for joining. Take care of yourself and see you soon.